Breaking news into CNN, President Trump has wrapped up a nearly hour-long call with Russian President Vladimir Putin, according to Russian state media TASS. The two leaders discussed Ukraine, Iran, and other issues. On Ukraine, a Kremlin aide said that President Putin told President Trump that Russia would not back down from its war goals in Ukraine. Let's go to senior White House reporter Kevin Liptak with more. Kevin, what more are we learning about what happened during this call?
Yeah, the White House saying that the call is ended, but that's about all they're saying. We're getting most of the details now from the Kremlin side of things. The Kremlin saying that Putin made clear to President Trump that Russia would not back off of its war aims in Ukraine, while at the same time saying that they would continue these bilateral discussions with Ukraine about potentially bringing this war to an end. And so I think if you're President Trump going into this call, very much hoping to make progress on bringing the Ukraine conflict to an end, it's not clear, at least from the Kremlin readout, that he had a great deal of success on that front, but clearly trying to keep open these channels of communication as he works to resolve that conflict. One interesting point that the Kremlin made was that the two men did not discuss this decision on the part of the Trump administration this week to put a halt on weapons shipments to Ukraine. The Trump administration had said that they were concerned about dwindling U.S. stockpiles and put those weapons on hold. That topic did not come up in these two men's conversations, according to Moscow. But it will be interesting to see if and when President Trump describes this particular conversation. You know, the last time that he was talking in public about Putin was at the NATO summit last week, and he said that he thought his Russian counterpart was misguided in this conflict, that he wanted to find a way to bring this war to an end, but that he didn't necessarily know how to do it. It will be interesting to see if this conversation changed the president's perspective in any way. It did come amid this flurry of diplomacy between the West and with Moscow. The French President Emmanuel Macron spoke to Putin earlier this week for the first time in 3 years. And so you do see sort of the diplomatic gears starting to grind, but at least based on the Kremlin's description of this call, it doesn't appear as if the war in Ukraine is coming any closer to a resolution.
The president just did wrap up his phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. I want to get straight to our terrific reporters. Kristen Holmes is still here, Natasha Bertrand as well, and we have joining us our one and only Jill Dougherty, who has been covering all things Russia for a very long time. Kristen, I want to start with you. You have been doing reporting. What are you hearing?
Yeah, so the call is over. It started around 10 a.m. It lasted for nearly an hour, and we still don't have a readout from President Trump. And just, you know, when we look at this White House, they're usually waiting for the principal, President Trump, to post himself instead of a traditional White House readout of how the call went. So we'll see if he puts something on Truth Social. But two things to keep in mind about why this phone call is so critical at this time. One, it comes right after we reported that the Pentagon paused some of the military support, ammunition that they had been sending to Ukraine, something that the Russians celebrated. Two, it also comes after we heard President Trump in his most candid moments at NATO talking about the difficulties of working with Russian President Vladimir Putin. He said for the first time that it was harder than he thought to end the conflict in Ukraine. He said for the first time that he believed it was possible that Putin had ambitions of obtaining more land and more acquiring more property, I guess is just a better way to put it, but then just Ukraine, that it wasn't going to stop. And he said that he's been very difficult to work with, that Putin had been more difficult to work with than he thought. It's been surprising to him. So all of that is in the background of this call with these two leaders. And I will note, nearly an hour is a lot different than what we heard last time, which was 2.5 hours.
Right. Okay, so you mentioned the reporting that you and other colleagues have about the U.S. pausing some munition shipments to Ukraine, including air defense missiles. That's according to senior White House officials. Natasha, I was talking to somebody who is an expert on such things who was saying, well, why did that happen before the phone call? Isn't that giving up some leverage that you might need? I mean, obviously there are different ways to negotiate, but it's giving up some leverage with Putin. Like, if you want to get Putin to do something, say, if you do X, then we will pause the munitions.
Yeah, I mean, this has been really surprising, and it was a decision that was made by the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Albert Colby. And according to the Pentagon, it was done in conjunction with the White House. It was done in conjunction with the Secretary of Defense. This was not a unilateral decision that Colby made. But at the same time, it did seem to kind of directly undercut what President Trump had said just last week about perhaps providing Ukraine with more Patriot systems, more Patriot interceptors, because he has throughout this conflict demonstrated empathy for the civilians in this war, particularly those in Kyiv who are under daily barrages by these Russian missiles and drones, and where these Patriot interceptors in particular are so critical and so needed by the Ukrainian people. And so for them to pause the delivery of a package of Patriot interceptor missiles, which again are crucial air defense systems, that weren't even allocated by this administration.
Right.
They were actually allocated by the previous administration, and that were not even actually currently in U.S. stockpiles. They were actually taken from defense contractors that were building them, is really kind of baffling, I think, to a lot of people that we've spoken to. And I think it speaks more broadly to this Pentagon and this administration's desire to say, look, we are now prioritizing the American warfighter. We are now, if you're Elbridge Colby, who's the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, we are now prioritizing the China
He's trying to send
theater.
a message.
Right, exactly. So whether or not the White House is completely happy with this, given that it seems to be a little bit undercutting what President Trump said, is another question, because we have seen this Pentagon do things before that the White House has not been fully briefed on.
Jill, we are getting some information coming from the Kremlin. Here is their readout of this phone call between Presidents Trump and Putin, that they talked about Ukraine and Iran. The Kremlin said it was a business-like call, but that Putin said Russia will not back down from war goals in Ukraine.
Well, what's new? I mean, that is what Putin says. That's what Putin has been saying for 3 years. So it looks as if nothing in this conversation, and again, we have to find out the details, but nothing in this conversation convinced him to stop fighting, go to a ceasefire. I know he does, and I believe in this conversation, he also said, no, but we are willing to get into negotiations. But that, again, is exactly almost verbatim what he said in previous talks. So I think, what's really important about this, and I'm not clear who asked whom to talk, who initiated the call. That would be important. Perhaps the others on the panel know. But this is a really crucial moment because Russia is pulling out the stops. This is their summer offensive, or at least the beginning of the summer offensive. They have people massed on the border, ready to go into Ukraine if they haven't gone in already. An estimated 100,000 troops. According to CNN, they are going to bring in 3 times the number of North Korean troops to go into Ukraine and fight. This is a very big moment. And so I think, there's been some vacillation from President Trump. Maybe I will give the Patriots, no, maybe now, we won't. And these are really important weapons. Putin can bleed the Ukrainians dry by simply these massive attacks where the Ukrainians have to burn up all of their defensive weapons. And that may be the purpose here. So I don't see any progress. In fact, I think we're regressing here.
Jill, real quick, you heard Kristen talk about, and we heard the President Trump talk about the fact that he's been surprised at how difficult Vladimir Putin is to work with. You have covered Vladimir Putin since the beginning of his time in government. Are you surprised?
No, not at all. I mean, Putin has been in power for a quarter century. And before that, he was in the KGB. So he knows how to manipulate. And in this situation, he has set out something that he wants, and he's going to find a way to do it, either by, force or devious methods or negotiations and pressure and exploiting situations. So no, I'm not surprised at all. This is modus operandi.
All right, Jill, thank you so much for your insights. It's always great to have them. Natasha and Kristen as well.